He was just a man standing by a river until everything changed in the space of a heartbeat. The sky above the Masai Mara was heavy with clouds, swollen from the previous night's storm, and the earth beneath David Thompson's boots squelched with dampness. The air smelled of rain and mud and something else, an eerie stillness, like the world itself was holding its breath. He had been out since dawn, moving along the edge of the Mara River, tracking animal movements and taking notes, when a distant, high-pitched sound sliced through the quiet. It wasn't a bird, it wasn't the wind. It was sharp, panicked, and unmistakably alive. David turned, scanning the banks until his eyes locked onto a flash of gold tumbling down the river's steep embankment. For a moment, it didn't register. It looked like a ball of fur, caught in a sudden landslide of wet soil. But then it moved, frantic, struggling, mewling, and the realization hit him like a blow to the chest. A lion cub, no more than a few months old. It had been playing too close to the edge, and the rain-softened earth had given way beneath its tiny paws. Now, the river had it. The Mara in flood season is not a forgiving force. What looked like a river from the surface was, in truth, a churning corridor of hidden death, unseen currents, sharp debris, crocodiles lying in wait. David stood frozen for a second, mind racing. There were rules, unbreakable rules, passed down from mentor to student, scientist to scientist. Observe, never interfere, never touch, never change the course of nature, no matter how brutal it seems. But in that moment, rules felt meaningless. He wasn't a professional anymore. He wasn't a photographer or a researcher or a visitor in the wild. He was just a man. And in front of him, a life was slipping away. The cub's tiny head bobbed once above the water, eyes wide, mouth open in a silent cry, before vanishing beneath the surface. Without thinking, he ran. He didn't remember deciding to. His legs just moved. Down the slope, across the mud, into the river. Cold, wild water wrapped around his body like chains, dragging him back, trying to take him under. The roar of the current drowned out everything except the pounding of his own heartbeat. He was waist deep, then chest deep. He didn't see the jagged rocks. He didn't feel the thorny branches or the bruises blooming across his ribs. All he saw was that small shape being pulled further away. For the first time in his life, David felt what it meant to be entirely powerless. Nature wasn't cruel, it was indifferent. It didn't care that a life was at stake. It didn't care about mercy. And still, he pushed forward, teeth clenched, muscles burning. He knew he was risking his life. But that didn't stop him, because some lines are drawn not in science, not in rule books, but in the soul. And when the time comes, you either cross them or you don't. Ahead of him, the cub's paw broke the surface for a split second. That was all the chance he needed. He lunged, arm outstretched, fingers scraping through water, grabbing fur, thin, soaked, trembling. For a moment, they both went under. The weight of the current slammed them together and threatened to rip them apart. But David held on, anchoring the cub against his chest, shielding its face with his arm, kicking hard with the last of his strength toward the shore he could barely see. And as the chaos of the Mara thundered around them, David had no idea what waited for him at the river's edge. He had no idea that more eyes than his own had watched that cub fall, and that saving one life would bring him face to face with 6 of the wild's most feared predators. Everything in David's training told him this was wrong. Interfering with the life and death rhythms of the wild wasn't just frowned upon. It was considered a betrayal of the natural order. He had spent nearly a decade earning the trust of conservationists and ecologists across Africa, proving that he understood the delicate balance between observation and respect. He wasn't supposed to break that line. But as he stood waist-deep in a river trying to suck the life out of the tiny cub pressed against his chest, none of that mattered. There were no colleagues here to judge him, no codes of conduct carved into the rocks. Just a life slipping away and another life trying desperately to hold on. The cub was shivering violently, its thin frame rising and falling with erratic breaths. Its claws dug into David's skin, not in aggression, but sheer terror. Its entire world had just been flipped upside down. One moment it had been playing under the cloudy sky, and the next it was drowning, gasping in a flood it was never meant to survive. David tightened his grip, murmuring nonsense under his breath, anything to keep himself focused, steady, moving forward. But the river didn't let up. The pull of the current was stronger now, dragging at his legs with renewed force. A sudden dip in the riverbed caught him off guard, and for one breathless instant he went under, coughing, sputtering, barely keeping hold of the cub, which had started to whimper in weak, broken intervals. He knew he couldn't do this much longer. His shoulder throbbed from where the current had hurled him against something hard and unseen beneath the surface. His arms felt numb, his boots were waterlogged, turning each step into a struggle. Still, he pressed on, searching for footholds in the slick, treacherous mud below. The shoreline felt miles away. The forest canopy swayed above him, distant and blurred, a cruel reminder that solid ground still existed somewhere. He just wasn't sure he'd reach it. Then, out of nowhere, the river seemed to shift, almost as if it had grown impatient with him. The current twisted, jerking him sideways, and slammed him into a floating branch that scratched across his back and nearly knocked the cub from his arms. He recovered barely, coughing as water poured from his mouth and nose. He tightened his grip on the cub, whose breathing had turned shallow and fast. Every second out here was another second they might not survive. And yet, beneath the fear, something else began to stir in him, a deep, primitive determination. David had always been a man of logic, of data, of carefully planned shots and calculated distances. But there was nothing logical about this. There was only instinct now. He wasn't thinking about the consequences or the aftermath. He wasn't wondering what others would say or whether he'd be criticized for breaking protocol. He was thinking about the fragile weight of the cub, the raw terror in its eyes, the way it clung to him like a lifeline. In that moment, David wasn't a scientist. He wasn't a man with a camera. He was just another living creature fighting to save something smaller, something defenseless. And for that, the river showed no mercy. Another surge of water hit him sideways, and he felt the sharp sting of gravel scraping along his legs. He staggered forward, now able to touch the riverbed again. The shallows were closer, maybe just a few more steps, maybe one more burst of strength. But even as he dragged his body forward, lungs heaving, legs burning, part of him knew the danger wasn't over. There was something watching him. He felt it, like the hairs on the back of his neck standing up, a presence, a weight in the air. It wasn't the river. It wasn't exhaustion. It was eyes. Eyes that had seen him dive in. Eyes that had watched him fight the current. Eyes that belonged to the family of the cub now breathing unevenly in his arms. And they were waiting. The river did not let him go easily. Each movement forward felt like lifting concrete blocks with his legs, every muscle trembling under the weight of exhaustion and strain. The current coiled around him like a living thing, pulling, tugging, whispering the same cruel promise. Give up. Just give in. But David refused. The cub's heart pounded frantically against his chest like a tiny drum, fast and fragile, a constant reminder of the stakes. It didn't cry anymore. It was too tired for that now. Its eyes were half-lidded, its breath shallow, as if it were already beginning to let go. And that terrified David more than the river, or the pain, or the looming presence he still couldn't see beyond the trees. He knew that if he didn't get to shore now, right now, there would be nothing left to save. He stumbled again, catching his foot on a submerged root. His knee buckled, and for a split second he fell forward, the weight of the cub nearly slipping from his grip. A jolt of adrenaline surged through him. He pulled the cub back up, cradling it tighter. One arm wrapped fully around its soaked body, while the other struggled to keep balance in the mud-slick shallows. The taste of the river was in his mouth, bitter, metallic, full of silt and decay. He spat it out and kept moving. 2 steps, 3. His feet found firmer ground. The water, once at his chest, now lapped against his ribs, then his waist. But his legs were shaking, threatening to give out, and his vision blurred at the edges. He forced himself not to stop. If he stopped, he wouldn't start again. Somewhere ahead, The riverbank rose gently toward the tree line. Just a few more feet. The cub gave a faint twitch in his arms. Its head shifted slightly, its nose pressing weakly into his soaked shirt. That tiny gesture, that small sign of life, lit a fire inside him. It wasn't over yet. Not if he could help it. And then he saw them. They hadn't made a sound. They didn't need to. One by one they emerged from the edge of the forest like ghosts born from shadow and silence. 5 lionesses, their golden coats mottled with damp earth, eyes fixed on him with an intensity that stopped his heart. They stood still, statuesque, watching from just beyond the trees. But it wasn't just them. From behind the tallest lioness came a figure larger than any he'd ever seen in the wild. The male. His mane was dark as dusk, his body heavy with power and age. He stepped forward, slow and deliberate, until he was fully visible. David froze, half collapsed in the shallows, still holding the cub. He couldn't move. Every rational thought in his brain vanished, replaced by one instinct: don't run. Running would mean death. So he stayed where he was, breathing raggedly, the cub limp but alive in his arms, eyes locked with 6 apex predators who had every reason to kill him. They didn't charge. They didn't roar. They simply watched. It was the kind of silence that doesn't come from calm, but calculation. The lionesses' heads were tilted ever so slightly, their ears twitching, reading his body language. Their cub was in his arms, wounded, frightened, wet, but it was alive, and somehow, impossibly, he had brought it back. David's legs gave out. He dropped to his knees, water sloshing around him, the cub still pressed to his chest. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know if the lions would take this as a threat, an abduction, a mistake too far to forgive, but there was no going back. He had made his choice in the river, and now everything, the cub's fate, his own life, rested in the hands of wild creatures with unknowable minds. And then the largest lioness took a single step forward. The lioness moved with a grace that made the moment feel unreal, like a dream balanced precariously between beauty and danger. One massive paw touched the muddy ground with deliberate care, followed by the next, her body low, her movements fluid, silent. David didn't breathe. He couldn't. Every fiber of his body screamed to stay still, to become invisible, to pray that the ancient rules of predator and prey might, just this once, be broken. The cub in his arms stirred again, letting out a sound so soft it was barely more than a breath. The lioness's ears twitched at the noise, her head tilting slightly as she came forward another step and another, until she stood just at the edge of the water, no more than 10 feet away. Behind her, the rest of the pride remained perfectly still. Their bodies were coiled like springs, not in preparation to pounce, but in the tightly wound alertness of creatures witnessing something they could not yet make sense of. The great male did not move except for a slow, subtle shift of his tail, a movement almost meditative, as if weighing the moment's gravity. His amber eyes were fixed on David, not blinking, not wavering. This wasn't curiosity, it was judgment. David remained on his knees, soaked and trembling, one hand under the cub's belly, the other gently across its back. The cub gave another weak mewl, its tiny mouth opening and closing in instinctive hope. David wanted to look away from the lioness, to avert his eyes, to lower his head in submission, but he couldn't. He was trapped by her gaze, held by something he couldn't define. It wasn't hatred, it wasn't rage, it was deeper than that, older. The lioness took another step, her paws pressing into the wet riverbank, leaving perfect impressions in the mud. The muscles in her shoulders shifted like rolling water beneath her fur, but her face stayed calm, almost eerily neutral. And then, without warning, she stopped. Her nose lifted slightly. She sniffed the air, once, twice, and David realized what she was doing. She wasn't just seeing, she was reading him, smelling for signs of threat, of violence, of fear, but mostly he believed she was searching for truth. Could a creature outside their world be trusted with something so precious? The cub let out a tired chirp, and nestled closer to David's chest. Its limbs were still shaking, but its breathing had slowed. The sound seemed to ripple across the riverbank like a signal, a tether reconnecting it to its family. The lioness's posture changed almost imperceptibly. Her head lowered by a fraction, her stance softened. Not relaxed, never that, but accepting. Then she made a sound, deep, low, and rhythmic, a chuff. It was not the roar of dominance or the growl of warning. It was the kind of vocalization lionesses use with their own cubs, when the world is calm and safe and nurturing. It was a sound of reassurance, a call of home. David felt tears sting the corners of his eyes, though he didn't know why. Relief, maybe, or awe, or the quiet realization that something was happening that defied every rule he had ever trusted about wild animals. The lioness moved again, this time not toward him, but toward the cub. Her massive frame approached slowly until she was just feet away, the space between them charged with invisible electricity. Still, she didn't lunge, she didn't growl. She simply stood there, gazing not at David anymore, but directly into the cub's face. And then the cub responded. A tiny cry, a familiar sound, a bridge stretching across fear and time. What happened next didn't feel possible, but it unfolded in utter silence and clarity. The lioness took one final step forward. The cub reached out, just barely, its paw trembling, and David, heart pounding, released his grip. For the first time since plunging into that deadly river, his hands were empty. The cub staggered forward, 2 small steps, and collapsed gently into its mother's front legs. She lowered her head, nuzzling it, sniffing, chuffing again. David sat motionless, still on his knees in the shallow water, no longer a participant, only a witness. Behind her, the other lionesses began to shift. Slowly, cautiously, they emerged from their statuesque positions. They approached not with menace, but with curiosity. Their eyes never left David, but their bodies carried the same tentative energy, like members of a court coming forward to examine the truth of a story too unbelievable to accept without proof. Then the male lion moved. His steps were not slow. They were heavy, deliberate, full of weight and meaning. He passed the lionesses without acknowledging them, his eyes locked on the cub, then David, then back again. As he neared the scene, a strange, hushed silence fell over the others. The power of his presence was total. Even the matriarch stepped aside, yielding to him. He came within just a few yards of David. His mane shimmered in the dim morning light, thick and wild like a crown of living fire. He looked at David not with hostility, but with an intensity that bordered on unsettling. David lowered his eyes for a heartbeat, his body frozen with fear, and then looked back. The lion did not roar, he did not growl. Instead, he lowered his massive head and sniffed the cub, who was now nestled in the mud, safe but still weak. What happened in that instant would stay with David for the rest of his life, not because of the fear, not because of the closeness of death, but because of what he saw in that lion's eyes. Recognition. There was no way out. David could feel it in the stillness of the air, in the dense silence that wrapped around the riverbank like a noose. He had come through the current with nothing left to give, half dragging himself and the cub to the shore, lungs raw, body trembling from cold and adrenaline. And now, as the last drops of water slid from his soaked clothes into the muddy ground, he realized he was trapped. Not by fences, not by force, but by the sheer presence of the lions now surrounding him. They didn't pace, they didn't growl. They simply stood, each one positioned with uncanny precision, forming a wide half-circle that stretched across the clearing, an unspoken boundary line drawn around David and the cub, one he knew better than to cross. Behind him, the Mara River raged on, indifferent and unstoppable, a reminder of the peril he had barely survived. In front of him, 6 lions, 5 lionesses, and 1 enormous male watched him with unreadable expressions, eyes fixed not just on the cub, but on him. He was no longer in motion. There was nowhere else to move. One step backward would take him into the water that nearly killed him. One step forward would breach the space they held sacred. He was caught in a moment that hung on the thinnest thread, with no script, no warning, and no protection. Every instinct screamed at him to stay perfectly still, but instincts were clashing now. Human instinct said to flee, to retreat, to make himself small and non-threatening. But every encounter he'd studied, every behavior he'd observed in the field told him something else. Never run from lions. Never. That single act flips a switch, ignites a response buried deep in their DNA. Running would mean he was prey. Prey gets chased, prey gets hunted, prey dies. So he knelt again, lowering himself slowly, cautiously, his legs aching with each motion. The cub, now curled weakly in the damp grass just inches away, whimpered softly, head resting against the ground. Its sides rose and fell in short, labored breaths, but it was alive. David didn't touch it again. He knew that would be seen as a claim, a possessive act. Instead, he placed his hands in the mud, palms open, showing emptiness, showing surrender, not out of defeat, but respect. The lions didn't move. David's mind raced, grasping for logic, for some shred of understanding that could tell him what was happening, what to expect next. He had no weapons, no backup, no escape. But the strangest part wasn't the fear, it was the stillness. The lions weren't behaving like hunters. They weren't acting territorial. If anything, they were observing him as much as he was observing them, gauging him, measuring something beyond physical threat. Perhaps it was the cub's scent on him. Perhaps it was the way he'd risked everything to pull it from the river. Perhaps it was something else entirely, something ancient and unspoken, wired into the primal memory of the species that had survived for thousands of years through trust, loyalty, and the harshest kind of love. The matriarch shifted her weight. That subtle motion, barely more than a whisper in the grass, rippled through the group. Heads turned, ears flicked. Tension pulsed in the air like a drumbeat. She was the key to everything. David could feel it. The others wouldn't move without her lead. She stepped forward, not aggressively, but with a slow, measured pace that carried authority. Her eyes, deep and gold and intelligent, never left him. There was something in them David didn't expect, something that rooted him to the spot and silenced even his inner fear. Not anger, not suspicion, but something closer to evaluation. The cub gave another soft cry, its voice reedy and tired, and the matriarch's head turned at once. She stepped forward again, closer now, just feet from David's position. She looked down at her cub, who blinked up at her, weak but awake. And then, incredibly, she looked back at David. The entire pride held its breath. There were no snarls, no leaps, no teeth, only eyes. David knew predators. He had studied them, documented them, respected them. But what he saw now unsettled him more deeply than any close encounter he had ever faced. This wasn't animal instinct. This wasn't a mother reclaiming her offspring in blind rage. This was different. She wasn't reacting. She was choosing, and David felt it with every beat of his heart. This lioness wasn't deciding whether to kill him. She was deciding who he was. He didn't dare move, not a muscle, not a breath more than necessary. Because in that impossible moment, David Thompson, a lone man on foreign soil, soaked to the bone and kneeling in the dirt, was being weighed in the eyes of a queen. Time felt like it folded in on itself. Seconds stretched into something far longer, heavier, thick with meaning and silence. The lioness stood just feet away, her paws sunken into the soft earth, the muscles beneath her tawny coat still but ready, always ready. Her eyes never wavered. They weren't glazed with the wild unpredictability of fear or the primal fire of aggression. No, her stare was cool, deliberate, conscious. She was reading him like a story told in scent and posture and stillness. And David understood, in a way words couldn't capture, that he wasn't in a moment of danger. He was in a moment of judgment. The cub gave a soft, rattling whimper and lifted its head. It didn't move toward her. It moved its nose instead, tilted it toward David, almost as if showing her, almost as if saying, "This is who brought me back." That simple gesture, barely more than a twitch, hit David harder than the force of the river. It connected the two halves of the scene like the final thread of a bridge, human and wild, fear and trust. And then she moved, not quickly, not menacingly. Her head lowered, slowly, gracefully, with the precision of ritual. One front leg bent, then the other, and she bowed. Her massive head dipped until her chin hovered just above the ground. Her golden eyes tilted up, watching him still, even in deference. It wasn't submission. It was something far older, a gesture of profound recognition, a moment stripped of species and fear and separation, one being to another, acknowledging. David didn't understand how or why. He only knew he had never seen anything like it in his life. He'd watched thousands of lions in the wild, seen them hunt, play, grieve, fight. He had studied dominance displays, maternal behavior, the complex hierarchy of pride life, but never had he seen this. Never had he heard of a lion lowering its head to a human, not in surrender, not in threat, but as if honoring something only it could see, and around her the world held its breath. The other lionesses stayed in their semicircle, motionless, their eyes flicking between the matriarch and the man she now acknowledged. Even the massive male didn't intervene. He watched, regal and silent, his presence like a mountain looming behind them, and in front of them, the bond that had no words began to take form. David's breath came shallow and uneven, his body locked in place, not from fear, but reverence. He couldn't bring himself to move. He felt like any wrong gesture might fracture the delicate balance, shatter the moment like glass. But nothing shattered. The lioness lifted her head again, slow and calm, and made direct eye contact. It wasn't the glare of a predator. It wasn't the cold stare of indifference. It was something else, steady, intelligent, aware. He didn't know if she understood what he had done. He didn't know if lions had the capacity for gratitude in the way humans did, but something had shifted. Something unspoken had passed between them, and whatever it was, it had changed the rules. The cub gave another soft mew, this time stronger, more alert. It struggled to its feet, unsteady but determined, and moved toward its mother. The lioness stepped forward just slightly, meeting the cub halfway. She let out another low chuff, barely audible, a sound David had learned was used between mothers and their young during calm, safe moments. She licked the cub's head, a single, slow sweep of her tongue, before turning her head again to David. And then she did the unthinkable. She crossed the final few feet between them and stopped so close he could feel her breath, warm, humid, heavy with the scent of grass and wild. Her face filled his vision. He could see every whisker, every scar, and she leaned in. Her nose touched his forehead, her rough tongue followed. She licked him, once, gently, deliberately. The contact was electric, not painful, not even shocking, just real, intimate, nurturing. It was the same gesture she had given her cub seconds earlier, the same gesture lions used to bond, to comfort, to include. In her world, that action meant one thing: acceptance. She had welcomed him into her pride. It lasted less than 10 seconds, but to David it felt eternal. When she pulled back, she didn't retreat with fear or suspicion. She turned back toward her cub, lowering her massive head to nuzzle it once more. The rest of the pride remained still, watching her, waiting. The authority of the matriarch was absolute, and her decision had been made. There would be no violence, no punishment, no rejection, only inclusion. David remained kneeling, soaking wet, caked in river silt, too overwhelmed to move. His heart thundered in his chest, not out of panic, but awe. He had come expecting to document the lives of animals from the outside. He had never imagined being momentarily brought inside. The lioness lay down beside her cub, curling her massive body around it protectively. Her eyes closed briefly, and for the first time since the rescue began, there was peace. A deep, grounding peace that rippled through the pride and echoed into the soil. And in that rare, sacred stillness, the line between man and beast blurred into something softer, something more profound than survival, more ancient than language. In that moment, David was no longer a stranger in their world. He was something else entirely. David stayed exactly where he was, knees buried in the damp earth, arms hanging loosely at his sides, his body so still it barely seemed alive. His heart, however, thundered in his chest like a drum echoing through a canyon. It wasn't fear anymore, at least not the kind that demands escape. It was the overwhelming weight of being seen, truly seen, by a creature so wild, so completely separate from the human world, yet now looking at him as if he belonged. The lioness had returned to her cub, curling around it, wrapping her massive frame like a fortress of fur and muscle. The cub nestled into her warmth, pressing its face against her chest, and let out a soft huff that sounded like a sigh of relief. Safe. Home. Loved. But the moment wasn't over, not even close. From the far right of the semicircle, a second lioness began to move, slowly, deliberately, her golden eyes fixed on David, not with malice, but with purpose. The others watched in silence. She came forward until she stood beside the matriarch, her presence calm but commanding. And then, unbelievably, she sat, right there beside him, just a few feet away, not in challenge, but in solidarity. The rest of the pride began to shift. One by one, the lionesses moved forward, their paws barely making a sound against the wet earth. There was no rush, no chaos. Each step was deliberate, as if choreographed by instinct and something far older than fear. They gathered close, not too close to corner him, but near enough that David could feel the heat of their bodies radiating through the air. Their eyes weren't hungry. They weren't calculating his worth as prey. They were observing him, studying his scent, his movements, the rhythm of his breath. He was being catalogued, but not as a threat, as something else, as someone who had passed a test they hadn't meant to give, but one that mattered more than words. And then the male lion moved. It was subtle at first, a shift in weight, a turn of his head, but when he began to walk, the effect rippled like thunder. The lionesses parted for him instinctively, granting him passage with the silent reverence given to a king. His paws sank into the mud as he approached, not with speed, but with gravity. Every footfall a statement. David's breath caught in his throat. This was the one predator above all others. The lion whose presence ruled not just the pride, but the territory itself. The others followed his lead, obeyed his signals, trusted his judgment. And now he was approaching David. The lion stopped just a meter away, his mane wild and tangled from the mist, his amber eyes sharp, calculating. They were different from the matriarch's. Hers had been wise, assessing, maternal. His were deeper, primal, layered with a different kind of understanding. For a moment, he didn't do anything, just stood there, looking. Then, slowly, he dropped his head, not low like the lioness had in her bow, but enough to close the distance between them. His nose twitched as he inhaled, once, twice, deeply. He was taking in David's scent, the river water, the blood from the scrapes on his arms, the lingering smell of the cub. It was a ritual, David realized, a kind of confirmation. This was how the lion would decide what kind of creature stood before him. And then came the sound. Not a roar, not a growl. A deep, rumbling exhale, low and guttural, like the earth speaking through his throat. It wasn't angry. It wasn't welcoming. It was an acknowledgement, a statement that said, "I know you're here, I've seen what you've done, and I accept it." David couldn't stop the tears that came then, hot and sharp and unexpected, not from fear, from the sheer intensity of it. The moment had cracked something open inside him. This wasn't just survival, it wasn't just luck. He had entered a realm where words didn't exist, where everything was communicated in breath and body and presence. And somehow he had been allowed to remain. The male stepped back and lowered himself to the ground with a quiet grunt, his forelegs stretched in front of him, head high, body relaxed. That one act sent a signal louder than any roar. The danger had passed. David was no longer under suspicion. He was no longer an intruder. He was safe. A wave of release swept through the pride. The lionesses laid down in scattered patterns, their bodies touching, forming a living web of muscle and warmth. The cub, revived by the comfort of its mother, sat upright now, its fur drying in the soft wind, its ears flicking curiously as it looked at David. It took one unsteady step forward and then another. It moved not toward the lioness, but toward the man who had pulled it from death's grip. It sniffed the air cautiously and padded up to David's side, brushing against his leg with a lightness that felt like electricity. Then it sat beside him. No one moved to stop it. No one growled or glared. It had chosen him, and in that moment the message became clear, clearer than any spoken language could ever express. He was no longer the outsider, not entirely, not anymore. He was something else now, a guest, a witness, maybe even just for a moment, one of them. The cub didn't leave his side. It remained planted next to David as if anchored there by an invisible thread, brushing against his leg every few seconds in a way that felt less like a need for protection and more like a gesture of loyalty. The pride had fully settled now, their golden bodies blending with the tawny grass and wet earth, their breathing slow and unified, like a shared rhythm pulsing through the clearing. But David wasn't allowed to slip into comfort, not yet. He knew this was a moment as delicate as a single breath between calm and chaos. He was still within the heart of the pride's space, their sacred ground, and his next move had to be perfect, not cautious out of fear, but respectful of what he'd been allowed to witness, to participate in. He remained seated, legs folded beneath him, soaked to the bone, arms resting loosely by his sides, and he waited. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the leaves of the nearby acacia trees, the smell of damp grass and lion musk thick in the air. The cub finally looked up at him with wide eyes, blinked once, then turned back toward the matriarch. She watched the cub's every move with laser focus, but made no attempt to pull it away. She understood something had shifted, not just in the cub's experience, but in the pride itself. A human had crossed a line, an ancient, forbidden one, and rather than triggering violence or rejection, it had forged something no one could have predicted. And then, with no sound to announce the decision, the lions began to rise. It was almost choreographed. First, the matriarch stood slowly, her muscles flowing beneath her coat as she stretched, and then looked toward the forest behind David. Then, one by one, the other lionesses followed, their bodies moving with a kind of quiet grace that didn't disturb the weight of the moment. Even the massive male stood, shook the dust from his mane, and fell into position. What startled David was not their motion, but their formation. They weren't gathering randomly, they were arranging themselves. Two lionesses moved to the front, positioning themselves like sentinels. Another took up the rear, and the matriarch and the male lion moved to David's flanks, one on either side of him, barely a body length away. The cub, without hesitation, took its place between them, still trotting alongside David's knee, brushing against him like a companion, not just a survivor. It wasn't random, it wasn't chance. They were forming a corridor for him. David didn't understand it at first. He only knew he was surrounded, but not in the way predators surround prey. This was different. It was too orderly, too symmetrical. They weren't closing in. They were creating space around him, a path. The formation was protective, intentional, almost ceremonial. He looked toward the trees, where his gear still lay scattered from when he'd thrown it aside and raced into the river. The lions were positioned in such a way that the line they created stretched from the bank of the Mara directly to that very tree. He realized then this was an escort, not an expulsion, not a warning. An escort. The matriarch looked at him, her head tilting slightly, eyes catching the light in a way that made them gleam like polished amber. Then she began to walk, her pace slow, deliberate, every step placed with regal precision. The male lion mirrored her on David's other side. They didn't look back. They didn't check to see if he followed. They knew he would. David rose slowly, his legs stiff and aching, his whole body screaming with the fatigue of survival. But he stood, not with fear, not with haste. He stood with the weight of understanding settling on his shoulders. The cub bounded a few steps ahead, then turned and waited, tail twitching in the air. So he walked. He walked through the corridor of lions, guided by creatures that hours ago might have torn him apart without hesitation. He walked with the cub at his side, flanked by a lioness who had shown him more grace than most humans, and a male lion whose size and power were only matched by his restraint. Every step took him closer to the trees, to the edge of their territory, but it didn't feel like an exile. It felt like a rite of passage. The air changed as they moved, warmer, lighter. The scent of the river was behind them now, replaced by the dust of the dry path beneath their feet. Birds called in the distance again, cautious but curious. Somewhere in the branches above, monkeys watched from the shadows. Even the forest seemed to recognize what was happening. Not a chase, not an escape, a procession. When they reached the edge of the clearing, the lions came to a stop. David paused, heart pounding. The matriarch stepped forward one last time, turned her massive head and looked directly into his eyes. Then she tilted it, just slightly, before pressing her forehead gently, softly, against his. A final mark of inclusion. A wordless thank you. She pulled away. The cub, now stronger, brushed against his calf one final time, then returned to its mother's side. The rest of the pride gathered behind them, watching in silence. No roars, no growls, just stillness and knowing. David didn't speak. He didn't move for a long moment. He simply stood there, a man who had crossed into something ancient, who had not just witnessed the wild, but been welcomed into it, if only for a moment. Then, slowly, the lions turned back toward the open plains, and just like that, they disappeared into the tall grass and trees. And David remained, standing alone, but never the same. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, watching as the last trace of golden fur disappeared into the tall grass, the final swish of a tail vanishing behind a curtain of leaves. The breeze had shifted again, warm and dry now, brushing across his face and rustling the trees above. It felt like the land itself was exhaling, like nature had just witnessed something so rare, so sacred, that even the wind moved more gently in reverence. David slowly lowered his gaze to the muddy ground at his feet, the faint imprints of massive paws surrounding him, like a memory pressed into the earth. They weren't just tracks, they were proof that something unimaginable had just occurred, that for a few brief, impossible moments he had been a guest among lions. He turned toward his equipment, scattered beneath the acacia tree where his day had first begun in quiet observation. It was all still there, untouched, yet it looked entirely foreign now, as if it belonged to someone else. Someone who had walked into the morning with rules and expectations, with boundaries that had just been shattered by the living, breathing reality of what he had experienced. The world hadn't changed. He had. David walked slowly toward the tree, his legs heavy but steady. The adrenaline had faded, leaving his muscles hollow, his movements slow and deliberate. Mud clung to his boots. Dried blood painted his hands and arms in streaks where thorns and rocks had torn into his skin, and his clothes were stiff with the drying remnants of the Mara River. But none of it mattered. Every scrape, every bruise, every ounce of exhaustion was worth it, because what he had just lived through wasn't just survival, it was something far greater, an encounter that defied logic, that erased the line between fear and trust, between species and silence. Just as he reached his gear, he stopped. Something made him turn back, one last time, to the clearing he had left behind. It was empty now, quiet, still, ordinary, but it wasn't just a patch of earth anymore. It had become something else, a space transformed by meaning, a place forever marked in his mind. And in that emptiness, he felt a presence, not threatening, not visible, but something that lingered, like a silent farewell pressed into the air, the kind that follows you long after the moment has passed. He knelt by his pack, his hands shaking now, not from fear, but from everything finally catching up to him. The weight of what he had just done. The weight of being chosen, if only for a brief time, by a pride of animals known more for their savagery than their mercy. He didn't know what it meant, not really. Scientists might argue over it, skeptics might dismiss it, others might twist it into myth or metaphor. But for David, the truth was simple and undeniable. He had looked into the eyes of a lioness, and instead of seeing a threat, he had seen a mind, a decision, a depth. He sat back on the ground, breathing deeply, letting the stillness sink into him. The cub's touch still echoed on his leg, faint as a whisper. The matriarch's forehead against his own lingered like warmth that refused to fade. These weren't things you could explain. They weren't experiences you could fold neatly into a report or dissect in a research paper. They were moments that existed outside of everything, stitched into a kind of silent eternity, buried deep in the heart. The sun was higher now, casting longer shadows across the grass. Birds had returned to the branches above, chirping as if the clearing hadn't been filled moments ago with 6 of Africa's most powerful predators. Life was resuming, sliding back into rhythm. But nothing could return to normal for him, not after this. He had always known that the natural world was more than what it seemed, that animals thought and felt in ways we were only beginning to understand. But knowing it from a distance was nothing like being inside it. David stood again, slower this time, less burdened by fear, more grounded in clarity. He didn't look for the lions anymore. He knew they were gone, or rather, he knew they had given him everything they needed to give. Their silence had been louder than any roar. Their acceptance had reshaped his place in the world. They had not spoken, not with words, but they had communicated more than most humans ever do. And as he picked up his things, slinging his bag over one sore shoulder and brushing the dust from his shirt, he understood one final truth. He hadn't just rescued a lion cub. The lions had, in their own way, rescued him too. In the days that followed, word of what had happened began to ripple out across the reserve. It started with whispers among the local guides, men and women who had spent their lives reading the land, who knew the signs and sounds of the wild better than anyone. They weren't the kind to be easily impressed. They'd seen droughts, migrations, battles between rival males that shook the earth beneath their vehicles. But this was different. The story that passed between them was simple at first. A lion cub rescued by a man, and a pride that let him live. But as the details emerged, as more voices added their recollections and rangers visited the site where it all took place, it became clear that this wasn't just another story passed around campfires to impress tourists. This was something else entirely, something sacred. And for David, returning to anything resembling normal proved impossible. The experience had marked him, not just in the scrapes that slowly healed across his arms or the deep ache in his bones from that brutal fight against the current, but in the way he now carried himself, quieter, slower, as if he'd left a part of himself in that clearing and taken something much older and wilder in return. He found himself revisiting the site more than once in the days that followed, not with any hope of finding the pride again. They were nomadic, elusive, far too smart to be tracked by one man with good intentions. But something kept drawing him back. Maybe it was the silence. Maybe it was the faint paw print still etched into the soil like a signature. Or maybe it was the need to convince himself that it had really happened, that he hadn't imagined the eyes that saw him, judged him, and let him go. Weeks passed, then a month, then another, and one late afternoon, as the sun dipped low over the plains, he saw them again. It began with a flicker in the tall grass, a movement so familiar his heart nearly stopped. Then came the unmistakable shape of the cub, now larger, sturdier, bounding ahead of the others like a child showing off to a long-lost friend. Behind him came the matriarch, her gaze just as steady, just as unshakable as the first time. She looked directly at David, and then, so casually it might have gone unnoticed, she gave a short, low chuff, a greeting, a signal. She remembered, The cub came closer, not cautiously, but with the ease of an animal approaching something that had once meant safety. It didn't hesitate. It moved straight toward the shade of David's parked vehicle and settled beneath it like it had done it 100 times before. And then it rested its chin on its paws, looking up at him with amber eyes that no longer held fear. The others gathered nearby, forming a loose perimeter in the grass. They didn't approach him, but they didn't avoid him either. They rested, yawned, groomed each other. They existed around him, as if he were not separate from them, but simply one more part of the landscape. For over an hour, David didn't move. He didn't speak. He just watched, heart full, the distance between him and the wild dissolving one breath at a time. Word of the second encounter spread faster than the first. This time, there were witnesses, rangers in the distance, guides who watched from a ridge with binoculars, tourists lucky enough to be nearby. It wasn't a myth anymore. It was real. A lioness had remembered a man. A cub had returned to him without fear, and a pride had rested at ease within meters of him as if he were something more than human, an honorary member of a family no one thought would ever open its circle to an outsider. The Maasai began calling him Ndugu wa Simba, brother of the lion, not as a nickname for tourists, not as a story to sell safaris, but with quiet sincerity. To them, who had lived beside these creatures for centuries, the encounter was not unbelievable. It was rare, it was sacred, but it was not impossible. They believed there were moments when the boundaries between human and animal blur, when the world, for reasons we can't see or measure, allows two beings to truly meet. Scientists came next, biologists and behaviorists, researchers who reviewed his footage, who analyzed the interactions frame by frame, tone by tone. They dissected every movement, every gesture, but no one could quite explain it. There was no precedent in lion behavior, no documented case of a pride treating a human this way, not after an interference with one of their young. Some proposed theories of misdirected social bonding, of the cub's scent masking his presence, of unusual but explainable tolerance. But even they didn't believe it. Not fully. They saw the look in the lioness's eyes, the way the male had flanked him, the cub brushing his leg with affection. These weren't accidents, they were choices, and that was the part that lingered the longest, the choice. Because in the raw wildness of Africa's predators, where life is measured by strength, by hunger, by instinct, something had overridden all that. A lioness had chosen not to kill, a male had chosen not to dominate, a pride had chosen to allow. And through those choices, David had seen the one thing no textbook had ever prepared him for: grace. From that day on, things were never the same. Tourism companies named new packages after him. Schools invited him to speak. Animal behaviorists reached out for interviews, collaborations, insight. But David remained quiet, almost reluctant to become the face of something that felt too sacred to capitalize on. He spent more and more time in the field, not chasing the lions, but waiting, always waiting. And every now and then, the pride would return. Not often, never for long, but just enough to remind him that what had happened wasn't a dream. It was a truth he now carried with him. He had saved a life that day, but more incredibly, he had been seen. And the wild had answered not with teeth, but with trust.